Well, we're going to talk about real faith this morning. We're going to talk about what the faith of the Bible is all about. And I pray that we can hear and we can listen God speaking through His Word, and I hope that today He's able to use me as an instrument to communicate His will and what He wants for us, to all of you. You know, we think about faith as having a belief in something based on no evidence or no proof whatsoever. And really, there's things that we do every day that we take on faith. For example, if somebody has a job, you know, all of us have probably worked a job in our life and we collected a paycheck from our employer. Well, we have faith that our employer is going to pay us on payday every week or every other week or once a month or whatever the schedule happens to be. We have faith that they're going to do it. And that faith is based on evidence and a track record of that employer paying us in the past and also paying all his other employees, right? Or her other employees. But that employer might just stop paying you one day, or might hand you a pink slip, or whatever. And if you believe that employer was not going to pay you for your work, you probably wouldn't start working for them, or you wouldn't work for them at all. We have faith that the seasons will change, and that's based on evidence. You know, the earth turns, it's a certain distance from the sun, but something could happen where the earth stops spinning for some reason. You know, who knows? We don't know all the mysteries of the earth, but we take it on faith that we have 4 seasons. And in New England, we have 4 real seasons every year. We have a real winter and a real fall and spring and summer. You know, it gets hot and super cold, doesn't it? We have them all. And if you just, wait a while, it'll change, So people base the fact that they grow their crops on faith that there will be a summer, right? If we thought it would be winter perpetually forever, then we wouldn't bother to grow things in our gardens, would we? So we all have varying levels of faith in things depending on the confidence that we have in them. And that's really biblical faith as well, and that's what we're going to talk about. Many people, like I said before, they think that our biblical faith is an unfounded belief, something without any evidence. People, for this reason, think Christians weak because they believe in something without having any proof. And to say such a thing would be equivalent to saying that somebody is weak-minded because they expect to be paid on payday, because they have faith that their employer will do such a thing. Of course, a responsible Christian knows better. And just like a person has faith that their employer will pay them based on evidence, so too do we believe that God will deliver on the promises that He has guaranteed to each of us. And He provides us evidence all around us, doesn't He? He provides us evidence in the world that's created and in the Bible, in the words of His inspired Word. I've been studying the book of Mark on Sunday mornings in the adult Bible class, and we haven't gotten quite this far yet. But there's a passage from Mark 9:14 through 29, and it's a rather strange account about demon possession. I think it's strange because it's handled differently than most of the miracles in the Bible, although there are a couple of other strangely performed miracles. And I want to set the scene for you and then kind of go into the miracle, how it happens, and I think why it happened the way that it did. Well, Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration, where, surprise, he was transfigured. He was created. His garments were made as white and gleaming as is, more than anyone would ever be able to do or replicate. And there was Moses and Elijah was up there, and his two main disciples were up there. I think it was James and John, and they were all up there, and they didn't, or Is it Peter and John? Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm drawing a blank right now. But anyway, so they are up on the Mount of Transfiguration. This amazing thing just happens. And they just come down to the bottom of the mountain. And they see the rest of Jesus' disciples over there. And they see a big crowd around them. And there's Pharisees and all these people. And there's a big commotion. And then they're trying to figure out what the commotion's all about. And then this guy who is labeled as the Father, he comes out of that crowd. And he says to them in Mark 9:18, I told your disciples to cast it out, and they could not do it. So basically he says, my son was possessed by a demon, and I took him to the disciples, and they could not do it. I said, that's their problem. They should have been able to, but they were weak. And that's probably why the Pharisees are over there too, giving them a hard time. And that's probably why there's arguing going on. Because the Pharisees probably loved it whenever something couldn't happen for them, right? I'm sure they just jumped on it and were like, yay, somebody fails, So Jesus' answer is rather peculiar. He seems to maybe be blaming the disciples when all this happens. In Mark 9:19 up there, he says, and he answered them and said, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me. And you might also be led to believe that this is the disciples' problem because they had just had a lack of faith in Mark chapter 8, right? Where they were worried about having enough bread on board the boat. After feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000, they were worried that they wouldn't have enough to eat. And Jesus is saying, right? What is wrong with you? But then he says this, and you think that maybe he's talking about the disciples not having enough faith to cast out the demon. But that's probably not who he's referring to, probably not who he's talking about. And I think that when we look at Mark 9:28 and 29, we can see that he's really not blaming them, right? It says, when he came into the house, his disciples began questioning him privately, why could we not drive it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot come out by anything but prayer, right? So he's saying, not necessarily that you did something wrong or that you were weak in some way or that you should have done something differently. He was telling them that they needed to take a different approach in this particular circumstance. But it's interesting that Jesus didn't, right? Jesus just drove it out of there. But let's get into why that happened. Sometimes miracles happen or don't happen based on the faith of the individual that desires for that miracle to take place. And in Mark 6:5-6, we have an example of that. And this is Jesus not doing miracles, not probably because he can't do them, but because of the people that he is doing the miracles upon. They don't have faith. In Mark 6:5-6, it says, and he could do no miracle there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and he healed them, and he wondered at their unbelief, and he was going around the villages teaching. I am surprised by this word, Not so much, but maybe just taken aback by it would maybe be a little bit more accurate. He wondered at their unbelief. That means it was amazing to him how little faith that they had, how little trust in God that they had. They didn't believe in him at all. And so he did not do very many miracles there. He did not affect change in their life because of their unbelief. And that's what's happening with this father too as he comes up. And we think about this father whose son was possessed by a demon and was throwing himself into the fire and throwing himself into the water and trying to destroy himself and acting erratically. Everybody's probably seen one or two of those horror movies where some kid is possessed. You can imagine that's probably a pretty good or accurate description of how people would have acted when they were possessed by a demon, because just total loss of control of someone's body. And the father, he was blaming the disciples. He was saying they didn't do it. They were unable to do it. They were weak. He says they could not do it. Never once does it occur to him that he might be the one that was the problem, or that he might be the one that was the issue. Miracles are done for lots of different reasons. And sure, Jesus can do miracles without anyone believing at all. And I think Lazarus is a real good example of that, because Lazarus couldn't ask to be healed, right? And he came out of the tomb and he was alive, and all the people were amazed, right? But most of the time, and many occurrences that it happens, that it depends on the people and their faith. It says in Mark 5:34, it says, "And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction,'" right? And if we look at Mark 10:52, it says, "And Jesus said to him, 'Go, your faith has made you well.' Immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road." You see, these verses here are telling us that faith is an important component of God working through a person's life. Jesus healing the faithful, people who were believers. That's what this is telling us. And that a lack of faith can mean a lack of action from God. Like, if you don't believe in me, then I'm not going to help you, right? If you don't believe. And this is kind of what happens with this boy. And if we take a look over here at Mark 9:21 through 27, we can see the incident unfold and how it takes place. It says, "And he asked his father, 'How long has this been happening to him?'" This is Jesus asking the father whose son was demon-possessed. "And he said, 'From childhood. It has often thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us.'" And then I love this line. Just think about what and Jesus said to him, "If you can? If you can?" Like, you're telling me? Right? Think about what he's saying. He says, all things are possible to him who believes. And immediately the boy's father cried out and said, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." Sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But he's saying, I get it now. I didn't have any faith. I was the problem. It wasn't the disciples. It's not you. I didn't believe. I didn't have faith that you could help me and that God was real. And it says, when Jesus saw that the crowd was rapidly gathering, all those angry little Pharisees that were going to pick at him, right? He rebuked the unclean spirit and saying to it, "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again." And crying out and throwing him into terrible convulsions, it came out, and the boy became so much like a corpse that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and he raised him, and he got up. End of the story. Miracle complete. The Father, when we look at this passage, you can just see him. Your disciples couldn't do anything. And I probably am doubting right now that you're going to be able to do anything at all. But hey, let's give it a shot, I'm just amazed at what Jesus says. He just says, if you can. And I wonder how often we ask ourselves that same question when we're thinking about our faith. If I can, do I believe? Am I really believing in God? Because in this particular circumstance, the healing was dependent on the Father's faith. The disciples could not cast out the demon, and Jesus probably wasn't going to if this guy didn't change his mind or change his heart. Jesus tells him to have faith and to believe in God. And it's only at this moment when it dawns on him that his lack of faith was the problem, not anyone else's. You can see the Father when he's thinking about this, you can imagine how he must have felt. He must have been helpless. It says since childhood, we don't know how old his son is, but maybe an adult now, a young adult or something. But how helpless he would have felt. How he would have been grieving. seeing his son acting like this, growing all the way up, into adulthood, just going into random convulsions and all these horrible, terrible things, and just having to deal with that, all that stress, all that nothing, feeling like you can't do anything all the time. I don't know about you, but that stresses me out when I can't fix something. And if you're a guy, you usually are stressed out when you can't fix something, right? You just think you can just find the answer on the internet or something and watch a YouTube video, and then you can go ahead and repair the problem, right? I know even when, the boys get sick, I feel helpless, or when they fall down and they get hurt, I feel helpless. I feel helplessness, like I can't do anything, and I take them to a physician. Well, this guy was at the end of his rope, dealing with this his whole life, that his son was around, feeling helpless. You do something, he says. And then Jesus says to him, all things are possible to him who believes. You need to take it out of that wheelhouse where you think it's somebody else's issue, or somebody else's problem, somebody else's faith. We have to have that same reflection on ourselves about our own faith and our own relationship with God. Are we like this Father in our relationship to God? Does that describe our heart? Are we doubting God's ability or God's power to make a change in us? How much faith do we have? And I think a lot of times you can see the amount of faith, the amount of belief that we have by how we treat God and how much of a part of our lives that He is. How seriously do you take your faith today? Or how seriously do you take your faith thinking this morning about it? Do you really believe? Do you really want to believe? Are you saying to God, help my unbelief? Well, if you are really serious about your belief, if you're really serious about the church, about God, then He will be the center and the focus of your life. A lot of us have all these things going on and all this stuff that we think we need to take care of, and all these things that we're worried about. But then when it comes to the things that we say are the most important to us, we show very little interest and very little effort when it comes to those things. It seems like either we take for granted that God is going to be there, or we don't believe that He really is. And we're just doing this out of some kind of weird sense of torture and obligation. And I really hope that that's not the case, because God is living and breathing and working in all of our lives all the time. And the more faith that we have in Him, the more we will see how much He affects and changes our lives. Now, that is not to say that we're not going to go through hard times. That is not to say that we're not going to go through difficulties, because those difficulties and those hard times are times when we can put our faith in something, right? What good is faith when everything is going great all the time? What good is faith when you get every single thing that you want, need, and desire? What point is there to have faith at that point? Think about it seriously, because that's what that's what Jesus said about the young rich man, right? If he can't enter the kingdom of heaven, then who can? And God says, with man this thing is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And He says that because when we have everything that we want and we have all the money to answer all the questions and all the things that we have to worry about, and we just have everything that we ever would need, then we forget about God. And we have this false sense of security that we can control everything in our life because we can just keep throwing a few bucks at it and it will fix it, right? We get in a car wreck and it doesn't wreck our life. We just buy a new car because we have so much money, this kind of stuff. A tree falls on our house and we can just repair it because we've got everything that we would ever need. Those are things that they don't ever have a test of their faith. So when it comes down to the end, when it comes down to the end of the wire and they're about to face death, they realize they don't have any control and no amount of cash No amount of money, no amount of power or influence can ever buy you away from that one. But with the poor, they know that they have to believe. They know that God is working every day, giving them what they need to live and survive. And that's why the faith of the poor is so much stronger in general in the New Testament when we think about all the examples. But not to say a rich person can't enter the kingdom of heaven, because with God, all things are possible, you know. But it's time for us, I think, to take a good look at our life. You know, do we believe in God or not? Do we really believe? Because if we don't believe, if we don't trust in him, then we might as well give up now. We might as well just, get up, leave, go out that door, and not come back. Because God's not going to fix your life. God's not going to make things better if you don't believe that he can. That man who was standing there asking Jesus to cast the demon out, he had to be invested. He had to trust in God. He had to believe in him and believe in the power for God to effect a change in his life. And if he didn't have that belief, then God wasn't going to help him. And the same thing is true for us. If we don't believe that God can do it, if we don't trust in him, then even when God does things for us, and even when God makes our lives better, we don't give God the credit. We give the credit to ourselves because we don't believe that it came from God, even if it did. So is there any point in this or anything else if we don't believe? We should stare down the face of that barrel of that gun and realize that someday we're going to die, and we're going to die and nothing's going to happen, right? We're just going to be dead forever. There's nothing after this, because that's the amount of hope that you have when you don't believe. There's nothing for us. But if you believe that there is something after when you die, and those promises are there for us, then you should have faith. And you should live your life according to the scriptures. You should remember that God means something to you and make that affect your life. And treat your life with the church seriously. Invest your heart and your mind and your soul into God. Because if God is real, then don't do it halfway. If we trust in our faith, if we trust in him to make the changes in our lives that we want to happen, and we want to go to heaven, then we can't do it halfway. You can't just kinda be a Christian. Jesus said, you cannot serve both God and mammon. You can't do it 1%, 5%, 99%. You have to be all in. And it's a hard thing to think about. It's a hard thing to realize that that's the way it is. And it seems like it's not fair sometimes. And it's frustrating. And we all go through these crises of faith. And I have been through some myself. But God can make our lives so much better if we just let go. If we just say, help my unbelief. God pours his mercy and his power and his love into each one of us. And I kind of think of faith kind of like a vehicle. And my favorite vehicle, the one that's like the closest to my heart, I think is really super cool, is a 1970 Corvette Stingray with 460 horsepower engine in it, right? Every guy's like, "Arr," Yeah, it's an awesome car, and it just looks really cool. And that is the vehicle that you want to have for your faith, that God pours his mercy, his power, his grace into, and just makes that thing go. But a lot of us are sitting here with our 1986 Yugo GV. And GV stands for great value. With the wires hanging out and the speedometer that doesn't work, and just occasionally starts, maybe if you're really lucky. And has a 40 horsepower motor. And God pours that same grace, that same power, and that same love into that Yugo. What do we want to be driving down the road? Do you always want to be in fear of breaking down and not having the faith to keep on going? You just have that Yugo GV and that's your life? Or do you want to be in that Corvette Stingray? Do you want to be breaking 100 on the street? Don't do that. But that's what it is. Faith is our car. It's what we're driving in life. And God puts that same power into each one of us. And it's up to us what kind of car we want to drive in life. That's on us. Jesus said, whoever believes, Peter said, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever changes their hearts, their minds, and they commit themselves to God. Because repentance and belief are dependent upon changing your heart so that you believe in God. And that is his call to all of us. That if you truly want to change who you are, if you truly want to give your heart and your mind and your soul to God, and you go and you commit yourself in the waters of baptism, you come out a new creation, then you know what? You can have faith and trust in his promises, and you can jump into that new Corvette Stingray and live your life the way that you should. That you can live a happy and good and wonderful life. Not because you have lots of money or lots of things, but because you have the security knowing that your eternal life is with God in heaven. And if you haven't done that yet today, then I do want to extend an invitation to you this morning. That if you want to come forward for any reason, I want to encourage you to do that as we stand and we sing our closing song, There Stands a Rock.